The Portsmouth docks smelled of brine, tar, and departure. Eleanor Whitfield stood at the railing of the Amaryllis, her gloved fingers resting lightly on the salt-scoured wood, and watched England shrink into a watercolor wash of gray and green. The April wind pulled at the ribbons of her bonnet, and somewhere behind her a sailor shouted orders about the mainsail. She did not turn. She had trained herself over 3 London seasons not to look back at things that did not want her. The decision to leave had been made in the quiet of a single evening, the kind of evening when candles gutter without warning and ink dries too fast on the page. Her uncle, a retired diplomat with a villa outside Florence, had written offering her a position cataloging his considerable library. She had accepted before the sealing wax cooled. The Ton would call it retreat. She called it surgery. Below deck, her trunk contained 12 dresses, 47 books, and a lacquered box of correspondence she had nearly burned in the grate of her rented rooms. Nearly. In the end, she could not bring herself to destroy evidence that someone had once looked at her with interest, even if that interest had curdled into dismissal. "Miss Whitfield." She turned. The purser, a weathered man with ink-stained cuffs, approached with a folded paper in his hand. "This came for you." Lad ran it from the coaching in not 10 minutes past, said it were urgent. Eleanor's heart performed a motion she refused to name. She recognized the seal before she took the letter, the heavy press of wax, the unmistakable crest of the Marquis of Ashford. 3 years of correspondence from that same hand had taught her the precise angle at which he impressed his signet ring. "Thank you," she said, because she had been raised to say thank you even when the world was tilting sideways. The purser nodded and withdrew. Eleanor held the letter. The paper was creased from a hurried journey, the ink of her directions slightly smeared where rain had found it. Ashford had never written to her. His previous communications had been brief notes delivered on silver trays, always perfectly timed to raise her hopes without satisfying them. The ship shuddered as the last lines were cast off. The gap between hull and dock widened, first inches, then feet, then a stretch of gray water that could not be crossed. Eleanor watched the opening grow. She watched the clerk who had carried the letter stand at the edge of the pier, his hands empty, his duty discharged. She did not open the letter. She told herself it was because the wind would tear the paper. She told herself it was because she needed to settle her cabin, to oversee her trunk, to compose herself before reading words that had arrived 3 years late and 20 minutes too soon. But the truth was simpler and harder. She was afraid. The Amaryllis caught the current and pulled steadily toward the channel. Gulls wheeled overhead, crying out in voices that sounded like questions. Eleanor tucked the unopened letter into her reticule and pressed the clasp shut with a finality that felt like armor. Florence would be warm. Florence would be new. Florence would not contain the Marquis of Ashford, or his seal, or his rain-smudged direction, or the memory of his voice in a library, speaking of her as though she were a curiosity he had tired of examining. She descended to her cabin and placed the reticule in the trunk, beneath the 12 dresses and the 47 books and the box of letters she had not burned. The channel rose to meet the ship. England became a line, then a memory, then nothing at all. Florence in December wore a golden light that England never knew. Eleanor's villa sat on a hillside east of the city, its terraced gardens descending toward cypress rows that marched like dark sentinels across the Tuscan landscape. She had claimed a second-floor room as her study, and there she spent her mornings translating 16th-century letters from Italian merchants to their English trading partners. The work required precision and offered no room for sentiment. She excelled at it. 8 months had passed since Portsmouth. 8 months of lemon-scented air and church bells, and the particular solitude of a woman who has chosen to be useful rather than visible. Her uncle, Sir Henry Whitfield, was a bachelor scholar who spoke more often to his manuscripts than to people. He asked nothing of her except competence, and she gave it freely. The unopened letter remained in the lacquered box, beneath a layer of old correspondence she had not touched since unpacking. Some nights, when sleep proved elusive, she felt its presence like a tooth she could not stop probing with her tongue. The news arrived with Sir Reginald Poole, a baronet of minor fortune and major gossip who appeared at Sir Henry's dinner table one Thursday evening, trailing port fumes and London chatter like a ship trailing wake. Ashford withdrawn, Poole announced over the roast pheasant as though commenting on the weather. Went to ground at his Derbyshire estate in June and hasn't been seen since. The engagement to Lady Margaret Harrow dissolved. Quietly, of course. The Harrows are livid. Eleanor's knife paused on her plate. She resumed cutting a moment later, the motion so controlled that her uncle, absorbed in his meal, noticed nothing. But Poole had the instincts of a man who traded in information. "You knew Ashford, did you not, Miss Whitfield? I seem to recall your name linked with his during the season of 14. "You recall incorrectly, Sir Reginald," Eleanor said, her voice smooth as polished silver. "Lord Ashford and I were acquaintances, nothing more." Poole's eyes glittered with unspoken contradiction, but he was not so foolish as to press a lady at her own table. He turned the conversation to Florentine politics, and Eleanor was grateful. That night she opened the trunk. The lacquered box sat exactly where she had left it, dustless and patient. She lifted the lid and removed the previous correspondence first, his notes, his invitations, the brief lines he had written her during their first season, when everything had seemed possible. Then her fingers found the unopened letter. The seal was cracked but intact. The rain smears had dried to pale watermarks on the paper. She held it under the candle and studied his handwriting, her direction, her name, the urgent slant of letters formed by a man who was, according to the dock clerk, running. She broke the seal. "My dear Miss Whitfield." She stopped. The address was wrong. He had never called her that. His notes had always begun with her surname, stark and unadorned. This salutation was formal and strange and somehow worse, as though he were writing to a stranger. She read on, and the room grew very still. London, April 1816, 3 years earlier. The Harrow ball was a crush of silk and candlelight. The kind of affair where reputations were polished or shattered in the space of a quadrille. Eleanor had worn a gown of deep blue, the color of a midnight sky, and Lady Margaret Harrow had complimented it with a smile that did not reach her cheekbones. Ashford had been attentive all evening. He had procured her lemonade, engaged her in conversation about her translations of Ovid, and danced with her twice, a statement of intent that did not go unnoticed by the matrons lining the walls. Eleanor had allowed herself to hope. Then he had excused himself to speak with Lord Harrow, and she had waited and finally gone looking for him. She found him in the library, the door ajar, his voice carrying into the corridor with the clarity of crystal dropped on marble. A provincial diversion, nothing more. The Whitfield woman has no connections worth mentioning. Her mother was a merchant's daughter from Manchester. You cannot seriously believe I would attach myself to such a lineage. Lord Harrow's answering laugh was low and knowing. Margaret will be relieved to hear it. Eleanor stood in the corridor, her blue gown suddenly heavy as armor. She did not gasp. She did not weep. She turned and walked back to the ballroom, collected her wrap, and left without saying goodbye. She never told him what she had heard. She never gave him the chance to explain. The next morning she requested her uncle's passage to Italy, and within the week she was gone. The memory had calcified over 8 months into something she could carry without cutting herself on its edges. Or so she had believed. The letter trembled in her fingers. The candle flame shivered in sympathy. "Forgive the lateness of this. I have no right to ask, and yet I ask. I have no claim to offer, and yet I offer everything. What you overheard in the Harrow library was a performance, a lie spoken for Lord Harrow's ear alone. He had threatened to investigate your mother's origins, to expose her birth and by extension your standing. unless I withdrew my suit and turned my attention to his daughter. I could not allow him to destroy you, so I destroyed myself instead. I thought you would remain in London. I thought I could explain. By the time I learned of your departure, you were already gone. I have loved you, Alina, since the night you corrected my Latin at Almack, and looked at me as though my title were the least interesting thing about me. I love you still. I will love you until the ink on this page fades and the paper turns to dust and the stars rearrange themselves into a different sky. If you receive this before the ship departs, if there is any chance, I am riding for Portsmouth. Wait for me, please. Yours in hope and in despair. Ashford. The letter ended. The candle burned on. Alina sat very still, the paper pressed flat beneath her palm, and felt the careful architecture of her life in Florence crumble silently around her. She had not waited. She had not even opened the letter. She had watched England recede into fog while the man who loved her raced toward the docks, his confession clutched in a stranger's hand. The distance between Portsmouth and Florence was 1,100 miles. The distance between what she had believed and what was true proved far greater. Sleep did not visit Alina that night. She sat by the window, the letter open beside her, watching the Tuscan hills emerge from darkness like promises gradually kept. The cypresses took shape first, tall dark strokes against a paling sky. Then the olive groves, silver green and ancient. Then the distant dome of the cathedral, rose-tinted by dawn. She had spent 8 months constructing a narrative in which she was the wronged party, dignified in her silent departure, blameless in her refusal to hear his explanation. The narrative now lay in pieces at her feet. He had lied to protect her. He had sacrificed his own happiness and hers to shield her from scandal, and she had repaid him by vanishing. The anger came first. How dare he decide what she could withstand? How dare he strip her of the right to fight for herself for them? She was not a glass figurine to be packed away when the shelf grew precarious. She was a woman who had survived 3 London seasons, who spoke 4 languages, who could manage a household and debate Cicero and look a duchess in the eye without flinching. But beneath the anger, cold and deep as a winter current, ran the realization that his choice had been rooted in the same soil as her own. He had tried to protect her from humiliation. She had protected herself by refusing to hear his explanation. They had both chosen pride over trust. She refolded the letter with careful hands and placed it inside her sleeve, against the pulse of her wrist. The morning post brought a second letter, this one from Lady Margaret Harrow, who had become Lady Margaret Ashby 6 months prior and was honeymooning in Rome. She was traveling north and wished to call upon an old acquaintance. The phrasing was polite, the implication clear. There were things to be said. Alina sent a reply, inviting her for tea. Margaret Ashby arrived in a carriage of glossy black, attended by a maid and a footman, and an air of determined graciousness. She had married a country squire with a respectable fortune and no political ambitions, a union that seemed to suit her far better than the match with Ashford ever would have. They took tea on the terrace, beneath a pergola draped in wisteria. Margaret waited until the pleasantries were exhausted before setting down her cup. "I came because I owe you an explanation," she said, "and an apology, though I suspect neither will be adequate." Alina said nothing. The letter in her sleeve felt warm against her skin. "My father discovered the circumstances of your mother's birth," Margaret continued. "He intended to make them public unless Ashford ended his attentions to you. Ashford came to our house the morning after the ball. He told my father in terms that left no room for negotiation that he would never marry me. He said he had already written you a letter explaining everything, and that if you would still have him, he intended to spend the rest of his life proving himself worthy of you." Margaret paused. A bee hummed in the wisteria. "He missed your ship by minutes. I have never seen a man so hollow. He stood on the dock until the Amaryllis was a speck on the horizon, and then he stood there longer. I know this because I followed him. My father's scheme had made me complicit in something vile, and I needed to see its conclusion. Aliner's voice, when she found it, was remarkably steady. Why are you telling me this? Because I have spent 8 months trying to be a better person than my father raised me to be. And because Ashford deserves his letter to be answered, even if the answer is no. Margaret departed an hour later, leaving Aliner alone on the terrace with the wisteria and the bees, and the weight of everything she had not known. The letter she wrote in response took 3 days to compose and filled 11 sheets of paper, each one discarded in turn. The first draft was fury. How dare you decide for me? How dare you lie? How dare you love me and let me go? The second draft was grief. I would have stayed, I would have fought, I would have trusted you if you had given me the chance. The third draft was something closer to the truth, a confession of her own cowardice, her own pride, her own refusal to open a letter that might have changed everything. She tore up all 11 drafts and burned the pieces in the grate. What remained was a single sheet with a single line. I have received your letter. I am still in Florence. The cypresses are beautiful in December. She addressed it to his Derbyshire estate, sealed it with her uncle's plain wax, and placed it on the silver tray in the front hall. There it sat for 4 days. On the 5th morning, Sir Reginald Pole departed for England. He offered to carry her correspondence with him, and Aliner watched her own hand extend the letter toward him as though it belonged to someone else. A reply to an old acquaintance, she said. There is no urgency. Pole tucked the letter into his coat and climbed into his carriage. The wheels turned on the gravel drive. The letter went with him. She had done it, she had answered him. And now she would wait. The weeks that followed were the longest of her life. December became January. The Tuscan winter settled over the hills with a gentleness that mocked her agitation. She translated her manuscripts, walked the cypress rows, took tea with her uncle, and calculated the passage of every day. A letter to Derbyshire required 10 days. A reply required 10 more. Adding time for Pole's journey and the whims of the post, she might expect an answer by the end of February. February arrived. No letter came. March arrived. The almond trees blossomed, white and pink against the blue sky. Aliner continued her work, continued her walks, continued the quiet performance of a woman who had made her peace with uncertainty. But every morning she watched the drive, and every evening she told herself that silence was itself an answer. What Aliner did not know was that Ashford had already left England. Her letter reached Derbyshire 11 days after Sir Reginald's departure from Florence. It found an empty house. The Marquis had liquidated his English holdings, the townhouse in Mayfair, the hunting box in Leicestershire, the shares in his brother's shipping venture, and booked passage on a merchant vessel bound for Livorno. He had received no reply to his dockside letter for nearly a year. He did not know if she had read it, if she had burned it, if she had married an Italian count and forgotten him entirely. What he knew was this. He had spent 3 seasons circling her like a planet around a sun, and he had spent 1 devastating year in the darkness of her absence, and he would not spend another. The housekeeper at his Derbyshire estate forwarded Aliner's letter to his solicitor, who forwarded it to his brother, who sent it by express to Livorno. It arrived 3 days after Ashford's ship docked. He read her single line standing on the Livorno quay, surrounded by crates of olive oil and shouting porters and the salt-same Mediterranean wind that had weathered her villa for centuries. I have received your letter. I am still in Florence. The cypresses are beautiful in December. It was April now. The cypresses would be beautiful still. He hired a horse and rode east. The morning Ashford arrived. Aliner was in her study, struggling with a particularly obtuse merchant's dialect and thinking of nothing at all. Her uncle's manservant appeared at the door. A gentleman to see you, Miss Whitfield, an English gentleman. He did not give his name. Aliner descended the stairs with her heart in her throat. He stood in the front hall, travel-stained and lean, his riding coat dusty from the road. The arrogance she remembered had been worn away by something harder and truer. He looked at her as though she were the shoreline after a long and desperate voyage. "I received your letter," he said. It was only one line. It was enough. She stopped at the foot of the stairs. 5 feet of marble floor separated them. 1,100 miles, 3 years, 1 unopened letter and 1 answered. "I should have opened it," she said. "I should have told you the truth in person. I should have trusted you to be strong enough." The silence stretched. Outside, the cypresses stirred in the April breeze. "I am told the cypresses are beautiful in December," Ashford said, his voice rough at the edges. "I should like to see them, if you will allow it." Eleanor looked at the man who had written her a letter she did not open, who had ridden to Portsmouth too late, who had spent a year in the wreckage of his own choices, and who had crossed a continent because one line from her hand was worth more than everything he had left behind. "You will need to stay at least until December then," she said. "I had hoped to stay considerably longer." She crossed the marble floor and took his arm. He did not pull her close. He did not speak of forgiveness or demand declarations. He simply covered her hand with his own, and together they walked out into the April light, toward the cypress-lined path where their future, long delayed, finally began.